Even if mathematical ideas were less exactly true of the world, the mere possession of them would be indirect evidence that they had some cognitive value and were in some way true. If we would show them to be false, we must propose other ideas on the same subject which shall seem truer. But what ideas, truer than those of mathematical physics, can we propose on the subject of the field of action or the dynamic world? Undoubtedly, if reality were confined to spiritual being, mathematics would be useless, and the study of it an idle pastime, if not a vice. And if any spiritual man like Pascal got too deeply entangled in mathematics, the sad effects might be seen in his self-torture and desperation. A faith founded on logic is an acrobatic and insane faith. It was not logical necessity, but hard practical evidence that first suggested mathematical ideas to the mind and afterwards confirmed and imposed them. Animal faith honors mathematical science, a fantastic construction in itself, for measuring reliably the footsteps of that stealthy material power that pervades the world. If mathematics measures these footsteps perfectly, mathematics is perfectly true. The reality of psychologists' subjective presence, whether sensuous or conceptual, belongs to a different moral or aesthetic sphere, not mediated by animal faith and not itself conveying knowledge of truth. Truth as the account of such experience may be which is conveyed later by memory or sympathetic fancy. For often the art of fiction may tell us the truth about the fictions natural to the mind. Nevertheless, intuition, which is simply sensibility focused in actually noticing anything, comes upon essences, not things, because in proportion as attention takes notice and honestly observes what it finds, it suspends that animal faith which was involved in fear or care or the physical impulse to react upon some physical stimulus. When clarified and thoroughly actualized, all data are essences. If the spirit could actualize and clarify everything, it would live altogether in its congenial ideal world, as it does with some lingering qualifications in mathematics and poetry and music. But in animal life this remains an interlude, something marginal and ulterior. Living attention comes upon essences with a bias, from some particular vital angle. They are stepping stones in a distracted career. Even if clearly focused in their own plane, essences do not dictate to us in what direction their relations shall be traced. In themselves they have no movement, no selectiveness, no propulsion. The choice of this or that path in further intuition is made by the animal mind, under suasion of casual interest or its own vegetative growth. Poetry does not make itself, poets must make it, and so mathematicians must make mathematics. Narrow paths are thus opened by accident through the compact thicket of essential being, and later comers, threading the beaten way, may suppose that they are surveying the whole structure of the labyrinth, and discovering the eternal logos, or self-chosen necessary truth. But the labyrinth, being infinite, offers all choices to the wanderer, and the pattern actually traced was selected by accident. Logic is a refined form of grammar. If in my prattle I obey a tendency, and later establish a rule to the effect that nouns shall be either masculine or feminine, and if I obey a tendency and make it a rule that adjectives shall match and prolong the gender of their substantives, then it is requisite for propriety of speech that adjectives and nouns should possess gender and should march in couples like clerical schoolchildren, the girls with girls and the boys with boys. And this contrast with this divided way of trooping together, artificial as it is in things without sex, opens the way to the most charming essences and beckonings of word to word in discourse, enabling us without confusion to pick our way through a minuet of cross references as in an ode of Horace. Yet grammar need never have adopted so fantastic a sexual analogy. It did so only because speech is radically expletive, redundant, and exclamatory, as thought is also. And in highly provocative sexual analogies, however far-fetched, will appear in all sorts of places, particularly when emotion is aroused, and will count for more in the play of description than does the strict truth of the object. There are other graver intrusions of the grammatical medium into the deliverance of thought. For instance, the relation of subject to predicate is founded on the circumstance that some words are proper names and merely demonstrative, like a pointing finger. Other words are names of essences, without traceable physical being, but appearing dispersed, repeated, and mysteriously intermittent in all sorts of places, or in no place at all, that is to say, in the mind. The proper name indicating and holding down, as it were, the physical object that concerns us in action, becomes the grammatical subject, and the names of such essences as this subject shares with other things become grammatical predicates and adjectives. This grammar registers admirably the education of the mind, for the mind is commonly awakened by some shock, and then proceeds more or less scrupulously to describe the circumstances and the qualities connected with that stimulus. Moreover, being a spirit beset by animal obsessions, the human mind can retain, compare, and synthesize its impressions, leaving the flux of existence to run on as full and turbid as it will. Yet this recollection and this withdrawal are always imperfect. The basis of spirit is itself material, fluid, and self-forgetful, while on the other hand, the knowledge gathered and the pictures painted by the mind are simplified unduly, conventionalized, moralized, reduced to types. And this does violence to the truth, since nature is not human education hypostatized. Hence the quarrel between the humanities and science, in which science evidently represents the interests of truth. If the problem were scientific, we should have to consider that science also is human, that neither in texture nor in scope can science be identified with the truth, and that the humanities too convey poetical information about historical matters. But the real problem is moral, and even if science presented the truth more honestly than the humanities, we should still have to ask whether these scientific truths were the most important, and even whether the knowledge of truth is the ultimate goal or good of mind. Frankly, it is not, when the mind is free. Spirit is the entelechy or ultimate fruit of life, and not a material instrument or means to action. And if once life were safely adjusted and directed amid material circumstances, consciousness of those circumstances would be superfluous except as it might be interesting, so that truth would take its place, side by side with fiction of every sort, to be valued not because true, for merely being true does not make things worth knowing, but only for invigorating and entertaining the mind. Such is the liberal life, and the humanities have this liberal character, although science also has it, in so far as the truth of it enlarges the imagination. But such poetic freedom in thinking is premature, and even criminal, when the psyche is living at cross purposes with the possibilities of life. Health must be established first and organized securely, and then the range and balance of spiritual interests may be left for free genius to determine. In any case, it would be a vain scruple in the lover of truth to quarrel with his intellect and with the grammar of his thoughts in order to put his ear closer to the ground. His ear is itself an animal organ, and its deliverance, sound, is a substance of nothing except music. The tread of oncoming reality may be conveyed more impressively or more accurately by one sense than by another, but in the end, only intellect and science will be able to reveal the method of that approaching attack, or the method of meeting it by any deliberate or artificial contrivance. There is no ground for deprecating this intervention of art and reason. Mind is better than matter in the estimation of mind, and this judgment is final, because only mind is capable of esteeming or judging at all. Attention to matter is therefore optional for a moral being, and important only when, health having been lost, art is requisite for recovering it, or when, as I was saying just now, attention to matter is spontaneous and self-rewarding, as it is for children and for the true naturalist. The office of matter is precisely to breed mind and to feed it, and while the fantastic, egotistical errors into which mind may fall, since it must conceive matter in terms of ideas, might seem laughable to omniscience, these errors do no harm to matter and very little to mind. An unbiased and literal understanding of matter would be incongruous in an animal, and for pure spirit such understanding remains an ulterior speculative ambition, legitimate certainly, since spirit is potentially omniscient, but rather beside the mark when, being incarnate, that spirit is beset by impurities which it must purge first, before it can ever understand anything or know itself. If it knew itself, spirit would be little pressed to understand the depths of matter, which cannot be changed. But spirit, by existing, does lend to matter a new mental dimension, expressing material organization morally and perhaps gloriously, better than idly mirroring nature and mind, if it were possible to do so, is to impose an ideal measure upon fluid things, and this not arbitrarily or insignificantly. For the very dependence of spirit, which might seem to condemn it to futility, renders it an index to deeper realities and an organ of truth. Thought would never arise or maintain itself. It would never succeed in imposing formal measures and unities on events, if these events, which include the biological organs of thought, were not already organized and self-distinguished in the bosom of chaos. The very existence of fiction endows fiction with a native relevance to truth. We are told by certain psychologists that although the dynamic order of events is not really mathematical fictions must be cultivated because they are useful in the practical arts. But why should they be useful if false? And how should they be false if they describe the efficacious order of nature, by which our existence and health and power of speech and thought are notoriously controlled? What better criterion have we of truth than pertinence to action and implication in the dynamic order of nature? Primitive imagination no doubt attributes power to wishes and prayers, or to formal rhymes and coincidences in the aspects of things. But that is superstition, and we gradually discover the true order of nature by attentive observation of matter, and experiments with it, and calculation of its quantity and movement. If arithmetical and geometrical notions gain such ascendancy over the expert mind, it is precisely because, in their abstraction, they are the surest measure of the concrete. By them we retrace the actual vectors of reality and energy in the living world. What the vitalists call life is, in comparison, but the aftertaste and rhetoric of motion. Irrelevant, then, as the inner cogency of logic may be to the truth, logic nevertheless possesses a natural truth in its first notions, in its chief lines of deduction, and in many of its developments. Such applicability rewards later speculation for the early diligence of mankind in studying material things, turning and molding them, and making their image precise in thought. Ideas are not true because they are clear, but often they have become clear because they were true. This truth gives continual encouragement to the dialectician in tracing his deductions and trusting his insights. Yet he goes too far when, with these ideas framed on the human scale and true and empirically tested on that scale, he presumes to fathom the depths of matter and of time, and to dictate to nature the mechanism of her motions. He ought rather to expect that in some dimensions of being, for instance, in the mind, or at a high degree of complication, as in living bodies, the applicability of his ideal science should cease to be perfect or should fail altogether. Not that in those regions there is less order than in the gross mechanical world. There is evidently more, and more organic order. But our images and thoughts are not easily adapted to those latitudes and longitudes, and the most signal instances of responsiveness in events seem to us miracles or accidents. Such limitations are not a fault in human logic or mathematics, as if mankind had been bewitched and ought to begin thinking with other images and other axioms. Even if such a reform of the intellect were possible and fresh ideal systems were developed expressly to fit the regions newly explored, the new logic and mathematics would not be likely to fit all reality, or to possess more than a limited and borrowed truth. Nature, we must forget, is in flux. This flux may move in any number of streams, according to any variety of methods, and even if, at one time, we had obtained an exact formula for everything, presently the flux might take a new turn and insensibly change its fluid constitution. Then the very accuracy of our earlier measures would render them worthless in a later world.